Our talk is Winds of Change at Sea, and offshore wind is to play a significant role in Ireland's decarbonisation. And the marine protected areas need to be identified in Irish waters to protect, conserve and restore our marine environment. But first of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm Susan MacDonald, Chairman of Dalkey Community Council and member of Dalkey Tidy Towns. This meeting has been is a collaboration with Killiney Bay Community Council. In McKinsella was instrumental in getting this meeting together because we feel that the local communities are not really aware of what is happening out there at sea, what is being proposed, and a conversation should begin now that between the communities, between our politicians, and between the developers who are going to push this forward. We really need, as a community, to know the background, and so this talk tonight, or this discussion tonight, is about that, to get us informed and to move us forward so that we are informed. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Regina Klassen, who studied marine biology with a focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation. For the past 3.5 years, she has been working with the Irish Wildlife Trust on marine policy issues with a focus on marine protected area designation and management. She has authored several reports during her time with the Irish Wildlife Trust, including one on the issues surrounding the management of special areas of conservation in Irish waters. She is the co-author of the report Revitalising Our Seas, which was published by the Fair Seas campaign in June 2022. Our other speaker is Shauna Keaveney, who is a local member of the community who grew up in the area. In 2021, she developed an interest in knowing more about plans for offshore wind farms in the area and the potential impacts for marine and coastal birds, fauna and habitats, in particular on submerged sandbanks. She has carried out extensive personal research around the issue and has made many submissions as a member of the public on wind farm applications and other policy documents. So here, before we go on, I should just ask you, would you please turn off your mobile phones? And the other thing that I have to tell you, the emergency exits are on your left and on your right, but I'm sure we won't need that. Okay, as I said, Emma contacted me about getting some public discussion going. Little public debate about the process around wind farm development has really occurred. Most information is coming from developers in the industry. There is some information in the newspapers, but it's mainly from the developers. Local interest, there's some there, but I don't think it's informed at the moment. And I don't think people realise the effect that these wind farms potentially could have on our marine life, etc. in the future. I have to stress that both of our communities are are in favour of this marine offshore wind farms, because we are aware that we have to go forward with sustainable energy. The concept of marine protected areas has not been at the forefront of the discussions around offshore wind energy, and this is something that will have is fundamental on where we choose the sites for wind farms in the future. So Regina will explain in detail about these areas. Not having designated marine protected areas is also a breach of EU law. We are supposed, as a nation, we are supposed to have this as a member of the EU. At present, I think we have 2%, which is deplorable. So I'll hand over to Regina, and she will explain more about these areas and the implications that it will have for the future.
So I'm Regina, and I'm going to be talking mostly about this report that we published in June. So I'm working for the Irish Wildlife Trust, but we've recently launched a campaign in February of this year called Fair Seas. So we're actually a coalition of Irish NGOs, Birdwatch Ireland, the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, and several others are involved. So, just a second. Yeah, so our main goal is to kind of support the Irish government in achieving the target of designating 30% marine protected areas by 2030. But as we heard, at the moment we're only at 2%. We also want to ensure that these areas are highly protected, because we know that areas that we have at the moment, especially areas of conservation, special protection areas, are simply not achieving their targets because they're not managed. Ireland's actually currently, there's an infringement case against Ireland because there are no conservation measures for any of Irish SACs. So I'm going to talk about the report now, Revitalising Our Seas. So the main purpose was to really kick off the discussion on APA locations in Irish waters. So this is by no means meant to be the final product. We don't want, we didn't start this process thinking these areas are it, they're going to be designated. We've done the job for the government, not at all. We are just, this is just like an initial analysis just to really analyze the species data that is currently available, just to get the ball rolling a bit and to get these kind of discussions going. So it's a great tool for engagement, and that's why we're here to kind of talk about it. So the main report findings, some of you will have seen a map on your tables, on your chairs. This one? So I'm going to go into the methods a bit further, but essentially there are 16 areas of interest that we think warrant further analysis, whether or not they qualify for marine protected area designation. There's 36% of Ireland's seas in total, so we're actually a bit above the 30% by 2030 target. So I'm going to talk through the methods a little bit. Essentially, the first thing for us to do was to identify a list of species that we thought were of conservation importance, because it's simply not possible to analyse all the biodiversity that we have in Irish waters. Go to the next slide. So that was the first task, to identify, okay, what needs kind of priority protection. And we had 5 broad species groups. So seabed species, and they're broadly based on the OSPAR list of threatened or declining habitats or species. So OSPAR is a regional sea convention that Ireland is a partner of. So those are the seabed species that we included. Then commercially exploited species, because there's a Marine Strategy Framework Directive, an EU directive that requires Ireland to have good environmental status of marine waters. And part of that is also commercially exploited species being in a healthy state. So we thought it was important to include in the Marine Protected Area Network spawning grounds of species that are currently not in a healthy state. So we included these species because we know we have existing spawning ground data for those. So again, it was important for us to kind of have a relatively quick analysis of existing data. The cetaceans, our colleagues at the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group analysed their very large data set of whales and dolphins. And again, they were shortlisted because we were short on time. So species that are in an unhealthy status or that are really important for Irish waters. Similarly with sharks, skates and rays, again, species that are in an endangered status, and then all the seabirds as well, Birdwatch Ireland analysed those. So the next stage then was to identify existing data sources. And again, that stage really shouldn't be underestimated. There's a lot of data out there. There's still a lot we don't know, but generally speaking, there's a lot of data out there, and it just has to be collated, and that takes a long time to kind of identify where it's available. Is it freely available? Do you have to request it? And then they're generally quite big data sets. You have to clean them up. And by the time you've analysed all that, several months will have passed. So again, a stage that took a significant amount of work. Yeah. And then once we had data and we were quite happy that it was good quality and it was usable, we mapped species occurrence, density, and richness. For the seabirds, we used slightly different methods, but I'll go into that later on. And sorry, just to show an example of where we looked at richness. So species richness, essentially identifying areas where there was the most amount of a certain species. So on the left, we have a map here showing the species richness of sharks, skates, and rays. And we analysed Irish groundfish survey data, so actually fisheries surveys where they use bottom trawls to identify what kind of species live where and how much of what. So we identified the species composition of the trawl hauls. So that's what we found on the left. And then the other maps show density of certain species. So we have Portuguese dogfish, which is a deep water species, so they're mostly found on the continental shelf in deeper waters, the shelf edge. And then taupe shark, which prefers more shallow sedimentary areas, so they're quite common in the Irish Sea. And similarly then to spur dog there, we have sort of Galway area as well as the Irish Sea. So shallower areas sort of below, above 200 meters depth. So it was important to just see what kind of habitats do these species prefer and then to draw conclusions of where potential MPAs for these species might be designated. And then for each of our 5 species groups, we drew individual areas of interest that we thought were important, and then we overlapped those to see where are the hotspots, where do species hotspots kind of overlap, because it's not really realistic to designate an MPA just based on the one species group. So we wanted to find biodiversity hotspots, also thinking about potential management measures. If you have an area that's important for a seabed species, and it's also shown to be important for birds, that really shows that clearly there's a good reasoning for designating a 3-dimensional habitat and having that highly protected. Okay. So I'm going to go into the individual species groups in a bit more detail. So here we have a couple of examples. I'm trying to zoom in a bit on the local area. But because it was a national study, it's quite low resolution data. So here we have the sharks, skates, and rays. Just 3 examples of species that tend to occur in the Irish Sea quite a lot. So we have thornback ray, and the darker the cell, the more dense the population is. So clearly off, a good bit off Howth there. Thornback ray and spiny dogfish seem to be quite dense. And then taupe a bit further to the south and also to the north of Ireland there. And based on that, we then drew individual areas of interest. So the areas on the left there in black, the dotted areas would be areas of interest specifically for elasmobranchs, sharks, skates, and rays, versus the final areas that we chose. So there was quite a bit of back and forth between all our species groups to make sure we find areas that work for more species rather than just one species group. Yeah. And this is the map for commercially exploited species. So we have spawning grounds that overlap. So out of our 7 species that we analysed, there are some where the spawning grounds overlap quite a lot. So with the Irish Sea there, you can see is quite dark, so we have 4 species that have overlapping spawning grounds there. Next slide. And this is it. So there's a very large cod spawning ground in the Irish Sea, haddock spawning ground as well, whiting, and a herring nursery ground as well. So quite an important area clearly for commercially exploited species. If they spawn here, then protection is vital to recover their populations. More maps. Apologies, there's a lot of maps in this report. So here we have kind of benthic features. So any species that lives on the seabed would be mapped there on the left, and their overlap. So the Irish Sea, I was actually quite surprised. I didn't expect to find a lot here, because I've been living in Dublin for a long time, and now I live down in Wexford. And you know, compared to the West Coast, I never really found that it seemed to be really diverse. But clearly on the sandbanks, there's quite a bit of life. So horse mussel beds, they look a lot like blue mussels, but they're much larger. And they form dense beds on the seabed, and they're quite important for other species then, because they form this three-dimensional habitat, important nursery grounds as well. Sabellaria spinalosa on the right, that map. Sabellaria is a type of worm actually, and it forms reefs as well. Really, really interesting habitat. Kelp, there isn't a whole lot on the east coast, but there are some lovely kelp beds in Dalkey, and I've snorkeled them. Zostra is seagrass, again, not very common in the Irish Sea, but you do have a Zostra noltii bed on Marion Strand. And sea pens are really interesting. They prefer muddy habitat, and well, most of the Irish Sea, well, a lot of the Irish Sea is sand or gravel. There is a big mud patch to the north of Dublin, and sea pens tend to colonize that along with nephrops. So it's actually one of the most densely trawled areas in Europe for the nephrops fishery. And you can see as well, if you're interested, just the big map, you have corals and sponge reefs that tend to colonize the continental slope, so where it slopes off to deeper waters. I think I have depth shown somewhere else a bit more clearly. And again, nephrops and sea pens overlapping there on the Porcupine Bank as well. Okay. So I'm going to touch on the seabirds, but my colleague did those analyses from Birdwatch Ireland, but I'll do my best to explain. The annex of the report, which is available online, explains it in detail as well, the methods that were used. So essentially, there was a seabird hotspot analysis done, which Birdwatch Ireland also did for farmland birds a few years ago. So a similar method was applied. So essentially, they picked out a red and amber listed species, which is based on the birds for conservation concern. So species that are essentially of conservation concern were used in this analysis. And they scored the records for each sighting based on the age of the records, so that newer records were scored more highly. And they also mapped species occurrence, density and richness, and foraging range of major colonies, as well as migration bottlenecks. And all of that information taken together, they came up with the important seabird areas. Yeah. So to give you an example of bird species richness, again, the Irish Sea areas around South Wexford and Cork Coast and Galway, again, scoring the highest. So between 19 and 28 of all seabird species found to the east of Howth there. So a really important area for seabirds around here. And then just to briefly show the hotspot analysis as well. So for red and amber listed species, we have the red listed on the left, again, a hotspot that showed up in the Irish Sea around this area here. We have amber listed terns, again, Irish Sea, extremely important. And amber listed gulls as well, some in the Irish Sea, but mostly the south coast. Then looking at foraging range of major colonies, so we know where the major colonies are, where the species breed, and Birdwatch Ireland had previous records where they tracked seabirds, and they took the maximum foraging range of the birds that they tracked, and came to the conclusion that, you know, using the precautionary principle as well, that technically that should all be protected from the colony where they breed all the way out to the maximum area that they forage, because of course course they have to feed their young. So that's essentially that's the area they rely on in order to feed their young. And then migration bottlenecks are essentially when the birds leave their nesting areas in the autumn. That's kind of the major hotspots where they accumulate. They tend to be kind of geographical outposts, like headlands and such. So again, extremely important, certainly for the autumn kind of migration. So these are the final areas for the seabirds. So all the seabird areas of interest are shown in red, based on Birdwatch Ireland's analysis, overlaid with our final areas of interest for all the groups combined. So it was, again, a lot of back and forth, trying to identify areas that suited the most species. So, you know, there have been some compromises made for sure. We could have gone a lot bigger, I think. Okay. And then briefly just to touch on the cetaceans as well. So we have in our East Coast area of interest, it was for cetacean-wise the most important for minke whales and for harbour porpoises. So just north of Howth there is a really dark spot for harbour porpoise. That means that it was the most dense of the Irish Sea. So I think that kind of concludes the methods. So I just wanted to touch on the existing marine protected areas that we have in Ireland. So you're not actually doing too bad around here. You have a few quite large ones. So the blue areas are special protection areas and the red areas are special areas of conservation. So these are EU directives. The special protection areas would be designated under the Birds Directive and the special areas of conservation under the Habitats Directive. And they're quite specific types of designations. And you have to have a certain feature present that's listed in the directives in order to designate those areas. So you can see that some of the estuaries are designated as both special protection areas and special areas of conservation. That means it's a protected estuary as well as being important for birds. There's one of the probably biggest special areas of conservation in Ireland, the Rockabill to Dalkey Island special area of conservation. Is protected for the harbour porpoise and reefs. And on the top there of the map you can see a relatively large special protection area, and that's because on Rockabill you have nearly 90% of the entire Irish breeding population for roseate tern, and they obviously need to forage, so it's about a 4 by 4 kilometre square special protection area, but as we saw earlier, they are known to forage much wider distances, so due to the Birdwatch Ireland analysis, we do think that that needs to be much bigger for the roseate tern. The one offshore is an interesting one. It's designated for bubbling reefs, which is a type of reef that contains methane. It's quite an interesting habitat as well. So the next slide shows the area protected areas around here compared to the rest of Ireland. So as you can see, whilst zooming in, it doesn't look too bad, but zooming out, you can see that the Irish Sea doesn't have much else protected. And then the next slide, please, shows Ireland compared to the UK. The UK, the difference is that the UK has national legislation that allows them to designate national marine protected areas, whereas Ireland only has these EU directives, so special areas of conservation, special protection areas. The only types of marine protected areas we can currently designate beyond 12 nautical miles from the coast. Technically, within the 12 nautical miles, you can designate natural heritage areas or nature reserves in the marine. But beyond that, you really rely on the SACs and SPAs. So Ireland's currently drafting national legislation so that we can designate more marine protected areas. But even you can see UK has special areas of conservation that are shown in green, that are just much larger than what Ireland has designated. So I think there's definitely scope for something a little bit bigger in Ireland. So I know this is forum mostly for offshore wind, so I will say a few things. We don't have an official policy. Fair Seas is currently working on offshore wind, but we would be thinking very similarly to what you outlined earlier, which is that of course we need offshore wind, we absolutely support it, but that we need good planning and it needs to be an ecosystem-based approach, and that good data and people that can analyse it would be absolutely essential in order to do either sensitivity mapping to identify areas that are currently in need of protection before rolling out large-scale infrastructure development, or give those areas full MPA status if the national MPA legislation is ready by then. And really, only once you've identified your sensitive areas should you be looking at rolling out large-scale infrastructure. Okay. Thank you very much.
Maybe you would like to ask Regina some questions now, but I think we should stress that not having protected areas in Ireland will lead to a back-to-front way of working. Areas that should be protected have not been designated or mapped, and this would be like approving a county development plan without having a zoning map. So to let these large-scale developments offshore be randomly granted licenses and leases before we have actually mapped our marine protected areas is the totally wrong way round to be doing it. Other countries in the EU, that's the system that they use. So it seems that we are really at risk if we just allow this offshore development, which is required, but to do it willy-nilly without really investigating and mapping our biodiversity around our shores is, we could have really serious consequences for the environment, for the marine environment in the future. So maybe you have questions for Regina?
Thank you very much. You might be able to hear me. I'm Councillor Michael Clark from Dunera Down County Council. I suppose we face a challenge as regards, as you mentioned earlier, Susan, how we tackle climate change. So I'm going to ask bluntly, and I'll be preempting the next presentation. In your considered view, are wind farms incompatible with marine protection areas? Do you think they'll have a devastating impact on the species that are there? Is there a difference between the types of species? Are birds more affected than other marine life and so on? And I'd also ask bluntly as well, can electricity cabling from offshore sites pass through marine protected areas, in your view, without endangering the species that are there? Obviously, we face difficult decisions, and I'm sure there'll be the second presentation, but given what you said, in your view, can wind farms and these marine protected areas coexist in the same place?
So, as I said, I can only speak in personal capacity. Fair Seas doesn't have an official policy on that yet. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature does have some guidelines, and they do say that kind of large infrastructure developments should not be put within marine protected areas. That presumably would include offshore wind farms. Also, the very good Marine Protected Area Advisory Group report that was published in 2020 does mention that wind farms really, I'm not sure what it says word for word, but there is something called other area-based conservation measures that they might be compatible with offshore wind, but MPAs, in my opinion, not.
Kirsten, I belong to Killiney Bay Community Council, and I thought that was a very good presentation. What I would like to ask is how much of that evidence has been taken into consideration by the people who want to install offshore energy. Now, I am in agreement that offshore energy is a necessity, But my main question is the closeness to the shoreline and the lack of information that we're receiving in relation to the structural potential of those wind farms. I would have expected a model, not a prototype, that's a different thing, but a model of the effect of an offshore wind farm, well, an offshore wind farm, we'll call it for politeness sake, on the aesthetics and the construction of the environment of Ireland. What are the effects on the sandbanks? Have any models been made? Now, I know that's not within your area of expertise, but it's something that I would like to raise in the issue. I think what I'm seeing is an overplay of investment on the part of European companies and the Electricity Board of Ireland in getting this thing up and running. And they seem to be sort of overriding us in our local perceptions of the issues.
Could you comment on that?
No, I know it's not your area, but I think it does feed back to the importance of the areas that we're talking about in terms of protection of areas. And I wouldn't like to see that infringed.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the importance of sensitivity mapping. So in the absence of marine protected areas, there absolutely has to be a modelling study done to see what is there now and how will it be impacted, and to make sure to steer clear of those areas.
So is that feeding through then to the company who are persistent in installing wind farm so close to the coast of Ireland, when the European average is to install it 22 kilometres from the coast? I'm not sort of asking you directly the question, I'm just putting it out there as an issue.
Okay. I think the developers have to go. There are various environmental examinations that they have to do, and obviously they put in reports to the government, etc. But it's our planning model for offshore wind farms, etc., doesn't make it easy for the public to find out about this, and to find out exactly what effects are going to happen to the various areas that the developers are choosing. So I think this is a whole issue that has to be discussed further with both the politicians and the developers. And we have to keep on asking those questions that you are doing. Okay. Any further questions?
Guy Briggs. I wonder, are there any overlapping? I know there are a few wind farms around the coast already. Is there any overlapping information between the location of those wind farms and your studies?
Okay.
That was actually the next item on my to-do list, is to map the offshore wind license and applications. So I haven't done that yet. I've requested that data, and I'll hopefully do that next year.
So that might be for next year's discussion when she's done her research. Yes, gentleman there at the back. Yes.
Hey Susan, and thanks very much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, have you submitted your research on this to the relevant government departments, because I mean, like the last question was kind of one I also have. It would seem to me, at least, that what you're saying should be the internal temporary protected areas do clash pretty head on, frankly, with what are known as the relevant projects. And I don't know if Susan mentioned them, but the problem is that in the legislation that was passed, there's a series of wind farm projects which are being given a special status in the law, and
Yeah.
those sites were chosen by the developers with no regard whatsoever to any of this stuff.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
that is a serious problem.
Mm.
They absolutely should not have been allowed select sites, and those sites be given a special status in the law. And when in the Dáil, when this legislation was going through, we challenged them on this, and we challenged them around the debate on the National Marine Planning Framework. And frankly, it's very worrying, because what the fear and what it looks like is these massive industrial wind farms that have been designated with a special relevant status are going to get a free pass on what should be a proper sustainable planning process. So I just think it's a matter of urgency that we get your brilliant research in to the relevant government departments and insist that they take cognizance of it, and that there should be nothing done that could potentially endanger areas that should be marine protected areas, because the government have had to acknowledge that their level of marine protected areas is a disgrace. It's a national scandal, you know, in European terms. So they kind of have to acknowledge that, but then they're going to do little I can see about it until it's too late. Because if those relevant projects are built, you can forget about marine protection after that, because the damage will have been done. So I'm just curious, have you had any official response? And to what extent have you mapped them against the relevant projects? Because they're the first ones that are going to come on stream, and once they're in, you know, really serious damage has been done, and we have to stop that now, in my opinion. Developers, it shouldn't be a sort of a rerun of what happened with developer-led planning on land, repeated on the marine environment, because we'll have the same disastrous consequences.
So the ministers, Darragh O'Brien and Malcolm Noonan, were actually at the launch of the report. So we took them out, well, Malcolm Noonan came out to Rockable Island and looked at the roseate terns. And we gave them a copy of the report, and I do hope they will read it. That's all I can say.
Well, we have to push forward that the government does take notice of this kind of research, because, as you mentioned, Richard, it's of utmost importance. I'll just take another couple of questions, and then we'll pass on to Shauna's presentation. Yes, gentleman, his hand up, sorry, and then you. Maybe the gentleman in the blue shirt.
My suggestion is actually, you know, some of the questions are preempting the next presentation, and that maybe we hear that and then come back to questions. That was my suggestion.
Okay. Okay. Well, do you want to go ahead, Shauna, then?
Yeah, is it okay if I just stay sitting, because I could refer to my...
Yeah.
Just really quickly, do you have your presentation just there? Just where it's... how many years I don't remember. Okay, so I'll jump in, and yeah, I just want to say I'm not an expert in any of this, but I have read into many lengthy reports on this, because as anyone who's become interested in this... Hello? Anyone who has become interested in this will have wanted to know more, will have gone to the government website, which lists all the accompanying information reports accompanying any foreshore license application, and there's a lot of information there, so it's worth reading into and to not be daunted, I suppose, especially in relation to technical terms. So my first slide is a little follows on from what Victoria was saying about phytoplankton.
Is that okay? Great, okay. So, phytoplankton. This is an important consideration in relation to wind farms because phytoplankton make over 50% of the Earth's oxygen. They are just like trees. Where do they congregate? They congregate in shallower waters, in particular, around sandbanks. That's a good place for them. And who feeds on them? Sand eels. Sand eels, which are in decline in many areas of the UK coast and other coastal areas. Sand eels also prefer shallow areas to feed and to burrow into the sand, which they do by burrowing tail first. So, large infrastructural projects are known to significantly reduce phytoplankton contents in surrounding waters. And this can become, obviously this goes way further up the chain. If you think of seabirds, all the seabirds that Alma was talking about, they feed on sand eels largely. In particular, protected species, terns, feed chiefly on sand eels, and they will fly quite a way to find the adequate kind of habitat and environment to find their food and to feed their young. And if they don't have sand eels, quite simply, they stop breeding and there's population decline. So, on there. Yeah. This is a map, I think it's NASA, who produced this map, which is hotspots of phytoplankton all over the world. Chlorophyll concentration. And, okay, so if you see the range, when it goes up towards the warmer colours, that's actually a good thing. That's where phytoplankton is concentrated. And you can see from the small map down on the left that off our east coast there is a high concentration of phytoplankton. So they like this area, and so many species and ecosystems depend on phytoplankton. But they are critical to the survival of all ecosystems in the sea. Phytoplankton is the primary producer. If phytoplankton dies, the food web collapses and everything dies. So moving on to, that's another map here which I've taken from Fair Seas, which I thought was particularly interesting because it shows the density around the east coast, which also would reflect there's more mapping around the east coast too, but very important to remember. So even larger turbines on nearshore sandbanks will block the sunlight needed for photosynthesis that the phytoplankton perform, and it will check the water flow, reduce nutrients and the production of phytoplankton. So that goes right up the chain, affecting even the rossworm, Sabularia spinalosa, Sabularia alveolata, the honeycomb worm, reef-building worms critical to the integrity and biodiversity of submerged sandbanks, who also feed on phytoplankton, damage to habitat. This is a local issue because there's a biogenic reef off Wicklow Head, which is within the special area of conservation, and that will deplete food in that area. This also knocks on to dolphins, harbour porpoises, whales, which in their own right absorb carbon. So this is really critical. Less phytoplankton will escalate the carbon problem. Okay, so the point I wanted to make, following on from this, is international best practice in the siting of turbines. And as you can see, a 100-metre high turbine would be sited 14 kilometres and out offshore. Then we go on and you can see right up until 310, which is a minimum of 27.9 kilometres offshore. There's a large project in the Bay which has a foreshore licence, and it's been up and doing since 2000, 2001. And that's good to know because their turbines have grown in size. There are less of them. There were, I think, 100 to start with, and now they're projecting 61 or so turbines, but they are now much taller in range. They're 240 to 310 metres high, and they are sited on the Kishan Brae sandbanks. And as you are aware, that they're about 10 10 kilometres off our coast, which will have a significant impact, however you want to see it, on the sandbanks, on the ecosystems they support, and on the protected species that are drawn to that area. It's part of the food chain. So just to keep you on that slide a little bit. So we have two problems: climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. So preventing biodiversity collapse is one of the main reasons for taking action against climate change. So the solution, reducing dependence on fossil fuels, right? Wind power, wave, solar should come into play. And as everyone is careful to state, we all support the concept and the rollout of renewables, but siting is everything. So in relation to onshore wind power, I'm going to give you an example of the wrong site which was chosen, which is Derry Bryan Wind Farm, which is now, by order of, I think, of Borpanola, is about to be decommissioned. There was huge damage to habitat there, which came down from the mountain that was on and polluted streams, and there was a huge fish kill and long-lasting impact there. So, of course, that's on land, and locals were immediately alerted to this, raised concerns, and took it to the next level. Out at sea, this is much more difficult to detect. You know, it's underwater, it's the benthos, it's the seabed that is affected. And if a point that's been raised is when exploratory works are ongoing, they employ seismic, sonar, drilling, dredging. These are sometimes quite intrusive, and these all create noise, vibrations, and in particular relation to the harbour porpoise, which Dalkey Special Area Conservation is designated for. It's one of the primary features, and this can very much affect harbour porpoises, but we won't know about that. We won't hear or see. Only a marine mammal observer who will be on a boat out in the sea, maybe more than one, but how they detect this and the effects on it, I'm not really sure. The thresholds to any damage. Okay, going on. So thereby, so already as I'm talking about this, you can see there's some beyond incompatibilities. It could be said that these two concepts, marine protected areas, which Regina's been talking about, and nearshore, large-scale, infrastructural wind farms are almost, in my opinion, irreconcilable because of the industrial sort of impact on these natural habitats that the turbines have. There is, you know, it's very complex. I was told by a spokesperson that it's a complex infrastructural project and it's very large scale. There's rock armouring beneath the sea around the monopiles of these turbines, and there's a huge lot going on underneath the sea on the sandbanks which are not visible to you or to I. We can't know this. So in relation to that, a lot of people would jump in and say, look, there's appropriate assessments, they have to count. So appropriate assessments take place, even part of foreshore licence applications. Part of that process is a Natura impact statement, which is critical. And here at this stage, what comes into play is the requirements of the Habitats Directives and the Birds Directives. So scoping at this point is critical. And just to scope how much these exploratory works which take place subsequent to a foreshore licence being granted, how much of an effect they have. So looking at one of these Natura impact statements, screening reports, as a layperson, I noticed that some diving birds had been screened out. And this astounded me because I thought this might have been caught at an earlier stage by someone possibly in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, someone in the Marine Institute, someone on the Marine Licence Vetting Committee, which is the body, non-statutory body that deliberates on the granting of these foreshore licences. But it seemed that no one had seen this, even if it might seem like a small detail. But diving birds, whether a bird is a diving bird, classified as a diving bird or not, is critical because of the impact on them of sonar testing. So going on. So mistakenly screening out some species can lead to baseline errors. So some of the species that were screened out in this particular Natura impact statement were kittiwakes, terns, herring gulls, fulmars, which are diving birds, and red-throated divers. They were screened out for underwater effects as non-divers, so that was not a great result from a screening report, which was supposed to be the basis for a foreshore license application. So quantification gives a clearer picture of what exploratory works can actually entail. And in relation to marine protected areas, this is interesting because the developer in question has to give a very clear idea of indirect or direct effects on the site in question. And once again, what is critical here is siting is everything. So if a place is not well sited, that's a problem. So going back to Dublin Array, Kishenbray Banks, which is relevant to most people who live in this area, I noticed going back over reports in relation to seabirds, they had been obliged by the terms of their foreshore license to carry out a baseline report on seabirds, and they got a very good report. It was excellent. This is back in 2000, 2001, because the foreshore license for Dublin Array was granted in 2000 and 2001 for 4 years. Okay, so they found that shallower sea areas such as Kish Bank are relatively scarce in this region. The Kish itself constitutes quite a large proportion of the available resource. Therefore, any effective loss of habitat would be more likely to result in significant ecological consequences. Alternative feeding areas with similar characteristics may well be limited. A precautionary approach would need to be taken. This is particularly the case where the conservation status of the populations using the Kish Bank is considered. The bank itself has sufficient conservation value to qualify for SPA status, Special Protection Area status, solely on the grounds of the roseate tern numbers that use it. And so they advised that the offshore wind project in relation to terns alone not take place on the banks. And that report would have been submitted to the minister in question, supposedly, or the department for consideration. But I just don't know how much attention was paid to this, because we're here talking about it now, how important these seabirds are, their range, what they forage on, and what is most important in what this excellent report on seabirds, a baseline report for the developer, pointed out was there are very few other alternative sites. They say that. Where else do they go? If there's disturbance or displacement, in all of these reports they say, oh look, they can go elsewhere. They actually can't go elsewhere. They fly sometimes 30 kilometres to get to these sites or more. And they fly from, for example, Rockabill, the roseate tern. Okay, so moving on. So the examples of the areas where birds fly from their roost, these are protected species: Rockabill, Skerries, Loch Bay, Oran's Eye, North Bull Island, Howth Head, Sandymount Strand, and Wicklow Head. So their recommendation was it would be inappropriate to construct a wind farm within its main area of use, i.e. the northern half of the bank. It would not be possible to be sure that significant impacts would not occur, and hence the only current solution would be to locate the wind farm outside the area used by this species. Okay? This was an excellent report that took place in 2000-2001, but it doesn't seem, the message does not seem to have gotten through on the importance of the sandbanks, of Kishenbray sandbanks here. You will find the report buried in a compendium on the website, compendium of environmental impact assessment reports, way down, and it's very interesting to read, and one must wonder why already back then they weren't thinking of investigating marine protected areas further and looking at maybe assigning one of them to those banks. In fact, the Kishenbray banks were at some stage up for consideration as a special area of conservation, and this report itself says on the basis of roseate terns alone, it would merit special status of special protection area because the density of the species that forages, breeds, and post-fledgling birds use this is critical. So that's another point to make. And often when you attend some meetings, such as one I attended recently in Dún Laoghaire, there's a talk of the artificial reef effect of a lot of these offshore fixed bottom turbines.
And you know, you'll hear people being very hopeful about how new species come in to these habitats and how they will colonize slowly the hard rock or concrete armor, the concrete mattressing that often has to bury the cables, and everything will be different but just fine. Actually, an EU report found that this was not always so and should not be relied on as a justification in general to say that all would be well, in particular in relation to sensitive habitats. And they found that on a wind farm in Nysted in Danish waters, in relation to the hopes that artificial reefs in all habitats would replace the biodiversity and not lead to biodiversity decline, was not really so, and they found that harbour porpoises' echolocation activity had dropped off significantly in relation to baseline levels over 12 years, meaning that they had just simply abandoned this habitat. It had been abandoned. And again, just to remind you that Rockabill to Dalkey SAC, one of the features is the harbour porpoise. So going on there, I wonder, do you have the, sorry, which choice? So we wondered why the Kish-and-Bray banks in particular, and there's 3 projects in course now, one of which is a relevant project, and that is, it started off as Kish-and-Bray Banks Consortium, and then it's become Dublin Array, and that one of the developers there is RWE, a major multinational energy producer, also a major, which is one of the major culprits for carbon emissions within Europe. So to some extent, my personal feeling is a lot of these very nice looking offshore wind projects are, to some extent, can be regarded as an attempt to offset large energy companies' carbon emissions. So in a way, we shouldn't let sensitive habitats be used as window dressing either. We need these MPAs to be sure that that does not happen, that there is not this irreversible effect. So here's the harbour porpoise, here he is. And in a report, ESB CSTAX came in, and they have an application, not a relevant project, not designated, but they have put in an application to set up another offshore wind farm. And if you look at the map, which unfortunately I don't have here, it's cheek by jowl with the Kish-and-Bray banks. It's a massive area right up against the Dalkey SAC. It's right up there. And here we are again in their Natura impact study. They have incorrectly stated the hearing threshold for the audible range and the impact on harbour porpoises of ultra-high resolution seismic, known as boomer, sparker, and what's more, minke whale, bottlenose, etc. And the submission of this person concluded that species range within this site, they remembered that one of the requirements of the Habitats Directive is that species range within the site should not be restricted by artificial barriers. Artificial barriers are not just physical, they can also be sound, disturbance, can also create barriers to a species. And of course, one of the requirements is also one of the conservation objectives of Dalkey Special Area Conservation, Dalkey Island, Rockabill to Dalkey Island, is human activities should occur at levels that do not adversely affect the harbour porpoise community at the site. That's pretty clear. And so the person who made this public submission noted that both of these site targets would be contravened as a result of the granting of this licence application, keeping in mind that this is, of course, just a foreshore licence for exploratory works. And frequently, in response to submissions, the developer has a right of reply, and the developer's right of reply will be to say in a very reassuring way, these are just surveys, these are just exploratory works. You don't need to worry, we're not building anything, okay? But then you need to know what these exploratory works entail. And here is a good chart of this. You can see up here. Seismic surveys, interestingly, I did not know this, affect marine mammals even more than wind farm development. And that was of great interest. Ship noise, all of this going on is, and if you thought this microphone was bad, you should hear what harbour porpoises might have to put up with. So this is really very critical, not to dissimulate or downplay the effect of exploratory work subsequent to the granting of a foreshore license on these protected species, and to be aware of this and to wonder what kind of examination these applications and their supporting documentation undergo, and by whom? By whom? Well, I'll tell you, one of the people that would be giving feedback on this is the National Parks and Wildlife Service of Ireland, who there's wonderful people there, highly qualified, but they are drastically underfunded. And a recent review of the National Parks and Wildlife Service found that they were not capable, they did not have the capacity to oversee their statutory obligations under the Habitats Directive in relation to our marine areas. It just wasn't possible as things stood. And this is, so if you are thinking and hoping, as I did, that there's going to be some very careful person vetting all these applications at government level, well, think again. Often these foreshore applications, these for licenses, are reviewed by a body who maybe none of you have heard of, the Marine Licence Vetting Committee. And I wanted to know more about the Marine Licence Vetting Committee. I wanted to know what kind of expertise made up these bodies that would decide on the granting of these licenses. Well, all I could find out was that there was a chairman, and he had a name, but I didn't find out the qualifications or the roles of any other of the panel who decided on these applications, which astounded me. For a non-statutory body, it seemed very much behind closed doors, and only recently, I think, have they made the Marine Licence Vetting Committee report on a licence application accessible. And often they're, by which it's interesting to note that Dublin Array, which is very relevant to this area, this community, as we go forward, did apply, and they note this in all their public documentation in a quite a reassuring way, that they have made an application for a foreshore lease. Foreshore lease is basically a further stage. It's a request for permission to begin the planning process to construct. And it's of note that when they applied for a foreshore lease in 2006, although interestingly these documents were only received by the minister in question in 2009, that's their stamp date, that's their time stamp. The Marine Licence Vetting Committee at that stage, and they did consider and sit in 2006, considered that they were not going to pass this to the minister for approval. They were not going to do that, because even the Marine Licence Vetting Committee, made up of members who don't know what their qualifications are, found that the developers in question at that stage, I think RWE was not in the picture, had come forward with no alternative site to offer. They had just plonked down the site that they had essentially bagged in 2001, which is really at the root of the problem between the conflict, the potential conflict between marine protected areas and offshore wind, is that the developers picks the site first and questions are asked later. And even the Marine Licence Vetting Committee said, look, there's huge data gaps here, and we are not going to refer your foreshore lease application to the Minister for approval. But you will still note that in many of their documents they say, which is critical to their status as relevant project, that they have submitted an application for a foreshore lease. Which I find, in my personal capacity, I find somewhat misleading. You can submit it, yes, but what was said about it? Not many people know what was said about their foreshore lease application at government level. So, moving on. So we wondered, and some of you may know my mum Rose, she's here as well. She's done years of work at community level on the beach and all of this. And in fact, she began to ask questions even earlier than me. And one of the things we asked, we had heard that the Kishan Bray Banks as a special area, and I would imagine that it qualifies in so many ways as a marine protected area, that whole area, which would link up nicely with Dorky, to Rockabill, Special Area Conservation, and also Wicklow Head, another SPA. It all makes sense, as you can see from the maps that we saw in Regina's presentation. And the Kishan Bray Banks were at some stage considered for designation. They appear here and there in various documents that they are under consideration to become a special area of conservation in as much as they are submerged sandbanks surrounded by water all of the time. It's the habitat, it's one of the Annex 1 habitats which is listed for necessary protection in Ireland. And we wondered why this had never happened, although, mind you, some areas which were designated, possibly because of the under-resourcing of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, have been sitting on a list, as the EU also found in their proceedings against Ireland, have been sitting on a list proposed or considered for designation anywhere from between 6 to 22 years without actually anything happening. So that was critical. And there's a document here which we found among the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan. And we were astounded to see that at the beginning of this, there was a note on this document, update to remove references to Kish and Braebanks SAC, which was of note to us. Why in 2012? What changed in 2012 to make the Kish and Braebanks fall off with all its features which measure up and completely with the requirements for a designated habitat as a sandbank? What had happened to that proposed status, which would have protected it, not on the level of a marine protected area, but to some extent? Well, that's a mystery. So now going forward onto this, yeah. So this again, I go back to the importance of who vets these applications. Who decides, is this a good idea or not, given that we are stuck, it seems, with the relevant project or relevant projects in these nearshore sites? So who says, no, this is probably not a good idea, and I'm going to take it back up the line and say, oh no, stop everything. There may be a term in the license or in the lease that says, no, we can actually now take that back. Other pressing concerns and requirements are at play. So here I put up something here which I found interesting in relation to Dublin Array. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service, their only comment, public comment, on this project, on the foreshore license application, and they've made many, there's a newer one in 2021, their comment was, nature conservation, the National Parks and Wildlife Service have no comment to make, which really flabbergasted me. I thought at least some feedback, and maybe they might have done what I did, pull them up on, or try to pull them up on oversights and comment on the extensiveness of the exploratory works, 60 boreholes up to 80 meters deep, extensive sonar testing, sub-bottom profiling, all of these intrusive acoustic testing measures. But they didn't, they had no comment to make. And in fact, this to some extent, played into the hands of the developer, because Inland Fisheries Ireland also raised several flags. These are important spawning grounds, also for fish inland. The sandbanks are critical. This is where they congregate, this is where they spawn, and it's a cycle that if it's interrupted, it can be a disaster. So in response to the concerns that they raised, the developer came back and said, it should also be noted, these are just exploratory, it's all cool, and it should also be noted that the National Parks and Wildlife Service did not provide an objection to the undertaking of the surveys as set out. And that kind of raised a flag to me. They're using, I suppose, to some extent, the inertia of a critical body, a critical guardian of these processes to dismiss other legitimate concerns at the consultation stage. And that seemed like something of an oversight to me now. Okay, so the Irish Wildlife Trust, I think, again, that's you, Regina, but I found this actually before I heard your talk. And they really provided an answer to this question about conflicts between marine protected areas and offshore wind or nearshore wind in relation to the East Coast. There's no escaping the fact that if this goes the way the government is planning, then the industry will have taken their pick of development sites, and the marine protected areas will just have to squeeze into whatever is left over. So that really answered the question in relation to this. Okay, now we can move forward. Okay, so you might think, you might not conceive as I do, you often see beautiful visuals, in particular from energy companies, about this beautiful sea and these wonderful turbines. And in fact, renewable energy is great, but what is the undoing of fighting carbon emissions is the wrongful siting of offshore wind in places where it's just not going to work. In particular, it would not work at all if the marine protected areas had been put in place 20 years ago. So here we are, look at these, look, this is the Kishenbray Banks, and you can see this was the initial application for 100 turbines, 10 kilometres from sea, and at that stage I think they were 145 metres high. And then you think of sand eels, phytoplankton, seabirds, migratory birds in particular, whose flight paths have not been properly mapped to this date by the many surveys done over the years, over 20 years, by some of these developers. They still haven't mapped the flight paths of these protected species and migratory birds. So you can see, wow, that's the sandbank, those are the turbines. At the base of those, in their monopile, is going to be armoured rock, up to 300 square metres or more, depending on the height, bigger and bigger. And then a crisscrossing of interarray cables, which can emit electromagnetic waves or whatever it is, and you have to wonder what's left of these sandbanks, what's left of this feature that would, if we had designated marine protected areas in accordance with the maps that we've seen and the richness of species in this area and the biodiversity that these sandbanks support, it would seem inconceivable that this would have even been entertained at government level as a proposal, or even granted initially when the developer selected the site, because there was no oversight of site selection by the government. There was no limit on the size of the site selected by the developer. You could draw a big circle wherever you wanted and apply for your foreshore license, apply to have that site in your name and roll on. So this has really been a thing. And you may wonder, was no one raising a flag at the initial stage when this site suddenly started to become active? You know, their foreshore license had been granted, and they had 4 years in relation to this area to really explore, carry out the necessary surveys, yes, on the nature and the environment that would be impacted by this, and you really have to wonder who spoke up on this, and we didn't know much. I certainly had no idea that this was under consideration. This site, I had absolutely no idea, and I live in the area, but thankfully, International Bird Life and Birdwatch Ireland, of which I am a member, recently because of the issues that I've discovered, did make very important points. They said this is a critical habitat for seabirds, for migratory birds. It's for very protected species. Due to their threatened status, all species of tern, in particular, the tern again, are listed under Annex 1 of the EU Birds Directive. And they raise this again and again as an issue for why, as they put it, developers should be guided away from this area by government. What does that suggest to you? That suggests that the government might have taken the lead here and said, wow, yes, of course, we better draw out some areas which are going to protect these species. It's a very reputable body, expert in this area, luckily has drawn our attention to the disturbance to foraging, breeding, feeding and resting that this development might have on seabirds alone. Okay? So further to that, let's go down a bit. And I think there's a map, generally Victoria, somewhere there. Oh, this is a lot of things there. These are some of the submissions that I could not get hold of, apart from under Freedom of Information, because the government archive, where you can look at supporting documentation for licenses, doesn't go back as far as 2001. So I got some of these submissions that have been made by Birdwatch Ireland saying, essentially, please develop a strategy to guide developers away from these critical sandbanks. So, and here is a map from Fair Seas, and it doesn't take much to see that this area, which is critical to seabird areas of interest, overlaps clearly with sites chosen by developers for development in the sea, and often on these submerged sandbanks where these seabirds feed, and they do not have alternative areas to go to. They fly quite far to get to these submerged sandbanks. So then if there's another map of the layout, okay, that's terns. These are the roseate terns upon which that initial report in 2001, commissioned by the developer themselves, said roseate terns, just on the basis of the community of roseate terns alone feeding on those sandbanks, you should not develop this area, and you won't find many other subsequent reports that raise that same point that are commissioned by developers, interestingly, because I believe there's something, tunnel vision. Even a reputable environmental assessment company that goes in, they've got to be briefed. Look, we're trying to get this over the line, and they have the developer has, of course, an agenda to get on with what they want to do. So this is, and you can see that area there, it's a square, oh, sorry, just there, you can see that. And that's pretty much bang in front of where the Kishenbrae banks are. That circle of high density, that hot spot is right there. And that's not just terns, that's many other species. Razorbills, guillemots, cormorants, fulmars, gannets, loads of very, very critical seabirds, which are also protected species. That's where they are, and nothing can take away from that. So here we go on. Here are all the proposed wind farms in this area. So recently I was interested, you might see, hey, that's not exactly what I remember, because the ESB, the Seastacks one that reaches right into Dublin Bay there, is ESB Seastacks project, which is extensive and which goes right up against Rockabill to Dalkey Special Area of Conservation. Then you see the two little rectangles, that's Kishenbrae Banks, Dublin Array, and behind them you see another large area, and you might say, hey, that's even bigger, because often as developers go in and renew license applications, their area for exploratory works, and thus their proposed area development, expands, and no one really seems to say anything about that, no one in government. So you see that behind that lump behind it, which is actually goes to the offshore point, meaning not within our foreshore, that's a recent, very recent foreshore license application in the pipeline, which I couldn't access documents for because they're not accessible yet, by Real Tanamara, which is a large, I think Spanish renewable energy company, and they've gone in there too. And I was really interested. I thought, wow, so even if the initial developers in that area who bagged the site in 2000, 2001 could say, hey, it's cool, we're leaving all these other areas around, we're being fine, just keeping to this long line of turbines, which in fact create a barrier, a physical barrier this time, of turbines, because there's other corridors. Well, where do you see corridors for migratory birds, or dolphins, or harbour porpoises to forage and breed in these areas, which will become high activity areas, vibrations, even pre-construction. So you can see that massive block there, and you go down there and you can see what essentially is a block. And one of the representatives of the most recent applicant in this area assured me, he said, oh no, don't worry, not everyone will make it through because we're somewhat in competition with each other. But that's scant reassurance, given that one of them is a relevant project and the others, having seen that in Ireland we can grant a site so critical, so sensitive to a developer to develop without any marine protected areas in place. Well, they thought, well, as I would have in their shoes, I suppose, if I was a developer, well, I thought, oh, I might as well throw my hat in the ring too in that area. It's the project costs are much lower when you're near shore. Who's going to let us do that? Well, maybe here. And they will also tell you, well, nearest to landfall, where the cables come in, to connect to the grid. That's an important thing. So I'm making a little time here. Yeah, okay, well that's about it. And if you zoom out, you can see last point. In the UK, those areas proposed are much further out. You can see the cluster around our east coast, which we've just learned about, all the species here, and you can see how far out they are in the UK. And if you zoom in other European countries, you can also see the same thing. They are much more carefully selected because probably, for example, the UK, the Crown Estate pre-selects the area in which development can take place for offshore renewables. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you, Shauna, for your presentation. I'm sure it's thrown up various questions, so I wonder. First question there, the gentleman.
My name is Peter Ryan. I'm one of the commercial fishermen in Dunleary. The reason, a member of a group of about 40 or 50 fishermen who fish down the east coast, mostly for shellfish. The reason why they want to put all these wind farms on these areas is not really to do with the distance from the shore, it's to do with the depth of the water.
Yeah, challenges, that's right.
So it's costing them little compared to what it would cost them out in 30 or 40 pounds in 8 or 10 or 20 fathoms, they don't have a problem with it, they just plant them in. The other problem that we really have with this is twofold. One is the cables. We have studies that we've been shown that where all these cables are crisscrossing on the ground, lobsters, shellfish, they don't cross over. It's been done. The government in Holland, they've done for the fishermen, now they're going totally against wind farm. The other problem we have is that those wind banks, they're talking about putting wind farms the whole way from Waterford to the border. That's what they're talking about, the whole way along, right? Those banks protect our coast. Anyone who goes out when there's a gale and northeast wind, go up the top of Killiney Hill, go up the top of Greystones, have a look out and you'll see the sea breaking on the outside of those banks.
That's right.
You start building wind turbines, you put one here, one here, one here, one there. I fish around Mullins, right, which is a rock sticking up out of the water, right? I fish around every day of the week. That is one rock sticking out of the water. It's smaller than the base of one of the turbines. On that rock, there is 5 or 6 different tides at different times of the day. So the water is going. You could come up on the inside of Docky Sound, the tides running north. You go on the outside of Docky Sound, the tides running south. The water is going to go absolutely crazy. And my big problem is that when you put all these wind farms in, the water's going to go mad, and it will scare out. That's what's protecting our coast. If we We've seen the 7 wind turbines down at Arthur.
Yeah.
Right? Now, anyone who remembers walking out to British Bay from, the outside of the main road, and you walk for 5 minutes till you got to the sea, well now you walk through it again, right? And I sincerely believe that the difference of what is happening with those 7 turbines has caused problems on shore. It's the same thing in Greystones. Even with a little bit of a harbour development they've done, right? The beach at the South Beach one year, completely banked up again the railway line. You get the next year, you get the wrong storms. Straight on out.
Yeah.
That's what's protecting, that's what's protecting. You mess around with a tide going down along the coast. I mean, we're not talking about a little development here. We're talking massive development.
It's large scale, and you're right, I forgot to mention that the shallowness of the water is often the reason for the choice of these near shore sites, because it costs a lot less to develop, and one can only imagine that would increase profit margins. These are commercial bodies who would have that in mind, right, for their investors, which they do mention. Yeah, so that's very interesting. Thank you for saying that.
So hand up there at the back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sharon Fisher. I'm just a local resident here, and thank you very much for your presentations tonight. They're incredibly informative. It seems to me that our bay seems to be constantly under attack. A few years ago, someone wanted to put an oil rig in the bay, and it was meant to be oil and gas exploration. They wanted to bring in, more recently, big cruise ships and dredge, the bay, causing further disturbance. And quite often you sit in these meetings and you think, what can I do? I'm only one person. But I think if you get 10 of your family and friends involved, and you let our local representatives know that this is a cause of concern, and pretty soon it will become an issue. And unless we all take action, we're all stakeholders, and there's a knock-on effect. If biodiversity goes here, the fishing is going to go, the tourism is going to go. It's just, all the people, the thousands of people that started swimming in the last couple of years, that's all going to stop if the biodiversity disappears. Yeah. So I just think it's very important. Your local councillors are working for you and your TDs. So if you can get people to write to them or call them, it becomes a big issue, and that's what we need to do now.
Good point.
Okay, thank you. Somebody right at the back with a...
Thank you. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. This knowledge is power. And the recent Infomar research surveys have illustrated that the East Coast is perfect for floating turbines. And fixed bottom turbines are really a thing of the past. And what is being proposed are the height of the Empire State Building in our sea, very close to shore. And what we're seeing tonight is the science, and the images even from NASA showing that phytoplankton, which is the primary producer, produces 50% of the Earth's oxygen, 4 times the amount of rainforest. Now, would you sell a rainforest to build the
Yeah.
We are a democracy, but this is not democratic.
Fargo.
Yeah, I'm Fergal McLaughlin from Sable Seafront in Dún Laoghaire. Like yourself, Susan, we've been trying to hold meetings to let people know what's going on, because nobody has a clue what is planned. And if we were worried before tonight, we're doubly worried. And I think particularly at two levels. One, the pathetic absence of marine protected areas, which you've highlighted. And secondly, the absence of a proper scrutiny. But who's going to assess all of this stuff? And we heard about the National Parks and Wildlife Service, how very badly they're structured to assess this stuff. And there was an article in the Sunday Times a number of weeks ago. The spokesman for Wind Energy Ireland was actually wondering about how capable on board Planola is to assess the outcomes. And I think anybody who's read a paper in the past couple of weeks will have a few questions about on board Planola as it is, without adding in another aspect. And Wind Energy Ireland were saying on board Planola intends to set up a special unit to give planning to these projects. And I'd just like to ask a question from your perspective. How do you see the role of on board Planola down the line? I don't know whether that's into your area or not, but how do you see on board Planola and their role down the line in granting permission to these? Because that is obviously a critical stage. So if you have any views on that, would be very interesting.
Well, I can just give you a brief idea. Yeah, under the new MAPS legislation, which is the new process by which developers will be vetted and go forward with offshore development, on board Planola is the stage at which the developer, having carried out their exploratory works and surveys, goes forward through the planning process. And the MAPS bill came in just a little bit before various issues came out in the press about the functioning of on board Planola. And while I don't, I think even before then, it seemed to me amazing that a body that was tasked only with development on land, with more and more judicial views being taken about decisions taken by on board Planola to override or to do that, it seemed amazing that they were now going to be in pole position as the people that would grant a vet and grant planning permission. It seemed amazing, but I think that's in the legislation now. That was before some of these matters arose, so I think it's interesting. It's timing can be funny, and I think that will be interesting to watch going forward. That's my main thing.
Oh, so many hands. Yes.
Just a very quick one. We have a number of TVs here tonight. Who are the representatives? Some in government. I'd love to know if they're going to take the science, the facts, the information we heard about tonight, and fight and campaign that these facts will be taken into account.
So we have some members of the government here. I wonder if any of you comment. Do you want to, and then maybe Oisin afterwards?
Absolutely. Minister, go ahead.
Hi, Corn. How's it going? Okay, hello. I think that was very interesting to hear, and I'll be listening to everything that's happening here. Clearly, the development of wind turbines in Ireland and offshore wind has been very slow. We have the Arklow Bank project, which I think was probably the first in the world, which the fisherman talked about, and the impact that that had on the coastline and on currents. But since then, there have been none. And in a lot of other countries, there have been a lot of development of wind turbines offshore. And what we tried to do is put them onshore mostly, because we had a lot of land. And a lot of times when that was being done, people in the areas where the wind farms were being built said, you should put them offshore because there won't be any problem then, you know. So, looking at where we are at the moment, there is an impact. If you carry out environmental development, you carry out an environmental project or environmental infrastructure project, you're always going to have an impact on the environment. And the question is it too much? Is it do more harm than good? And that's the balance, that's the question that has to be decided. And it has to be decided rationally and with scientists and also with the public looking in. And an example of where it goes wrong, I guess, would be the wind farms that were built on active bogs. And at some point it was realised that if you build a wind farm on a bog, which is living and active, that you remove more carbon from the bog than you save in the electricity that you generate. And the Derry Bryan disaster wind farm, which sort of is which became a big scandal, was the ultimate example of that. And so that there's a right place to do a thing and there's a wrong place to do something. You can do more harm than good if you're not careful, and that's why the process has to be as carefully managed as possible. Now, in terms of where this is going, obviously these are live planning applications, but the direction from the EU at the moment, the latest recommendation from the Commission in May was, which is called Repower EU, recommends that we need to speed up the development of renewable energy, that we need to compress the time during which planning applications are considered across the EU. In general, and the reason for this was in response to the lack of energy coming out of Russia, the Ukraine war, and the obvious 40 degrees Celsius in the UK and so on, the climate change problems. And so the proposal from the EU is that there will be a maximum period of 2 years to decide any large-scale planning application, and that every member state should designate special areas in the map, which are areas where, these are called go-to areas, where it would take a maximum of 12 months to make a decision on planning. So that is the direction of that. I mean, that's a proposal from the Commission. It's not agreed yet, but that is, I would guess, the strategic direction that the EU is heading in at the moment as regards planning. Now, a lot of the time that's taken up with deciding something in Ireland is not the planning; it's the subsequent legal battles. And then, of course, there's a large period of time, like these applications that we're talking about, the Dublin Array in different forms. Has that been going on for 20 years, is it? Or was it first?
Their initial foreshore licence application was made in 1999-2000, and it was made by the Kish Bay Consortium, who were Sergas, who are very active still on shore, ESB, still in the game, and another English UK company which pulled out, funny enough, they were the third party. That's when that happened, and that's why it's so astounding that maybe they weren't guided off that site at a critical stage, which would have really had a good result for additional marine protected areas in the future.
I think the fact that there have been large offshore wind farms built in Europe is a reason to look at those and look at the experience from those and see what effect they are having on the environment, and directly see from them, what we can learn from what's happening, because we're not pioneers in this. We're 20 years late into what's happening. But I really appreciate hearing all your views tonight, and I'll take that back with me when I'm working on this.
Excuse me, can I just say that the European initiative and advice is to have offshore wind farms 22 kilometres from the shore. And that is being absolutely ignored by our government and planning departments. And I think that we're being sold something on an esoteric. Now, I agree that wind farms are important, and I agree that fossil fuels have to be reduced, but I think that we're being sold this as a package that has already been decided far in advance. Now, if you look at the companies that are involved, ESB is one, and there are others. But why have them so close to the shore? I mean, we're harping on about this. There are other sites. Now, we may say that it's cheaper to build them near the shoreline, but what we're actually talking about there is sandbanks, which don't have an esoteric or a permanent structure. They move, and yet there seems to be no inclination to do an offshore mock-up of how a wind farm would affect the area constructively and in the building process. So we have this cluster, and I personally feel, and I do have a bit of an actual professional interest in the area, I feel that this has been foisted upon us without any sort of indication of detail, structure, resonance or acceptance.
Just to say one thing there, I forgot to say also in relation to what you're saying and the importance of this sandbank and how it's mobile, dynamic, it's almost like a geogenic reef.
Absolutely.
It's like a geogenic reef created over thousands of years by wind, wave, water currents, which will all be altered. And another thing, the sea is the biggest carbon sink in the world. That's what's doing the carbon sink work. So if you mess with that in the wrong area, by your declared aim of reducing and mitigating carbon emissions, it's totally counterproductive if you do it in the wrong area.
Well, we see that continuously in the Killiney area.
Yeah.
We are
Okay.
Stony Beach.
Yeah.
Stones come up, stones recede. The weather, nature derives the structure of the environment.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much. At the outset, Susan and Regina and Shauna, thank you very much for the presentation and indeed for organising tonight. I think the attendance says a lot about people's interest in the area and interest in the topic in particular. And yes, a lot of it is relatively new. A lot of new legislation has been brought in. Regina touched on it there initially. And some of it, I mean, there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of new rationale for new legislation. As the Minister, Oisin Smith, has said, we're probably a decade behind or even maybe 2 decades behind where we need to be. But one thing is for sure, that the foreshore licence was old legislation, it wasn't fit for purpose, and I think it needed to have an updating, and that's exactly what's before us. But just if I may touch on the presentation that we saw, the site location or the relevant projects that Regina and Shauna both referred to. Interestingly enough, they form part of the Marine Protected Area consultation that took place in February of 2021 until July 2021. Now, I'm not sure how many people here were aware of that consultation or indeed made submissions to the consultation. But if I can quote just from the preamble of that, just 2 lines, the relevant projects are those that either applied for or were granted a lease under the Foreshore Act of 1993 or Foreshore Wind 1933 and also the offshore wind projects that were eligible to be processed to receive a valid grid connection offer in December 2019. Now, there was question marks of where the projects came from. That's the rationale for it, and that was in the public domain. I'm a member of the Climate Action Committee in the Oireachtas, and we've had many discussions with various individuals about renewables. And yes, there are questions, obviously, of how close to the foreshore they can be. I know Arklow, I think it's about 10 kilometres off the foreshore. And I suppose one of my questions from the presentation would be floating versus fixed. I hear Peter had said there about the lobsters, for example, the cabling. We're still going to have the same problem whether it's fixed or floating. But I just want to hear maybe the panel's view on the fixed versus floating. And obviously the closeness to the foreshore, that's something to be considered as well. And Oisin has referred to the Green Deal and Repower EU, and obviously that's the trajectory, I suppose, of where Europe's moving to. And obviously recent events that we're all very familiar with, not only with Ukraine, but indeed the need to move to renewables at a quicker pace is driving all of this. But yes, the Dublin Bay Array, I remember we were in a meeting in Dalkey Town Hall that was maybe 5 times larger than tonight, and the hall was packed because people obviously had concerns. Then there was consultation around that, and I would expect and hope that there will be consultation around all the applications that we're going to see. And then ultimately it'll go for a decision. And then MARA will be, or the Marine Area Regulatory Authority, will be established by January of 2023. But in advance of that, those relevant projects, I think 6 in total, or maybe 7 actually, 6 in the East Coast and 1 on the West, are pre-selected. But as I say, for me, nothing about being behind closed doors about those. It was formed part of the public consultation. It was very clear that they formed part of the legislation. In fact, there was a legislative bill specifically about those in advance. So anyway, but thank you very much for the invitation. Delighted to be here.
Okay. Tom, do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, just on a couple of things there. Within the harbour and the MPAs, there are many things that would have effect on an MPA. Everything from shipping right through. And if you had an MPA in Dublin Harbour with the amount of traffic that comes through there, the amount of fishing that may go on from Hope and so on, do you see that we would have to reduce shipping or reduce the size of shipping within that area there because it became an MPA? Would you have to stop fishing within those areas as well? Because as we do know, if you go back 200 years, we had massive fishing industry in this area here, but they've been fished out over the years, and we've lost a lot of our fish stocks through overfishing over many years. And do you see that, like, it might be likely that we would bring an end to fishing in an MPA area to make it recover or to keep it sound? The other thing is, I'm just looking on the map of England there, and I'm pretty familiar with England. And I was looking at the big wind turbine area out in the North Sea, which is marked in purple there. It's way offshore. But as far as I know, that's on the Dogger Bank, which is very shallow area, which is one of the big areas within the North Sea, because the North Sea is a very shallow sea. And I also know there around Liverpool, which I'm familiar with the wind turbines off the coast of Cheshire and Liverpool there. You can see them as you're coming in and driving along the road there. That is all very shallow area. And as you go north towards Morecambe and Morecambe Sands, that's also quite a shallow area up there as well, where wind turbines are going in. And a lot of the areas around the English coast, they're not in deep sea, they're actually on shallow areas, even though they're far out from the coast. Where within the middle of the Irish Sea, if you take it, it's actually quite a depth within the middle of the Irish Sea. I think it was 130 metres depth in the middle of Irish Sea, something around that, which is really deep. But also we have to look at, and I don't know if the report has considered what has happened in other areas like Denmark, where they have, I think, 20 to 30 years experience with offshore turbines, and around areas that, you know, which would have very sensitive biodiversity areas, particularly around its islands within the Baltic Sea as well, and also within the North Sea too. Is there anything in the report that has looked at that and seen where the benefits, where it went right and where it went wrong within that as well? Because I think it's important that we learn from other countries what was done right, how it developed, whether it brought benefits in the area, because I know in some of the developments it has brought benefits in the area. Fish life has come back. In other areas it might not, and we have to see what went wrong there and what went right in the other things to develop right.
Maybe Regina could
Yeah.
answer.
And just one more question. Do you have a copy of the report? Because I haven't seen the report, or where they can access it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start with that. So it's available online. We only printed very few copies, so it's quite a big chunky thing, and this doesn't even include the annexes, so the online version.
It was emailed to us, I think.
Yeah, it should have been emailed to. And the report is just an ecological analysis. So we only looked at where do the species live and where would it make sense to protect them. So we haven't looked at any pressures. We haven't overlaid fishing. We haven't overlaid offshore wind. We haven't looked at any of that yet. So obviously very important questions in terms of how is this going to impact socioeconomics. And that is definitely something that the government should do, absolutely. So once you have an idea of where marine protected areas might go, that you then do a socioeconomic analysis. Generally speaking, of course, marine protected areas, the primary purpose is to protect and restore marine biodiversity. should not do anything that would stop that from happening. And in terms of fishing, so again, International Union for the Conservation of Nature has guidelines for that, and generally industrial scale fishing should not be happening in marine protected areas. So if you're taking out an amount of biomass that would stop the area from recovering, then you're no longer protecting the area and defeating the purpose of the MPA. The other questions were around wind farms in Europe, and it's actually quite interesting because we're working with a network of NGOs around Europe, and generally the issue is that a lot of European countries, Germany for example, want to now put wind farms within marine protected areas. In Ireland we have it the other way around. We're looking at, we're going to have wind farms and we don't know whether or not they're going to be marine protected areas sometime in the future. So certainly that discussion is happening at EU level elsewhere. Dogger Bank being a really incredibly important sandbank which has a lot of management issues, not just potential offshore wind but fishing as well.
And it had oil there for many years too.
Yeah. Okay, this gentleman there, the dark sleeve. Yeah. No, behind you. Yeah, you. You've been trying to talk for a while.
I was, yeah.
Sorry, sorry, Richard.
No, it's fine, Susan. Yeah, Richard Boyd, Sabre Sea. Look, the second last day of the Dáil last week, there was an amendment brought in to a planning bill which none of us had seen before. The bill was to do with a thing called substitute consent, which arose directly out of the Derry Bryan disaster, where a wind farm was built. They cut down trees on the top of a mountain to build a wind farm, and the mountain collapsed. Right? And Ireland has been fined millions as a result of that. This legislation rose out of that problem, right? And that was serious enough. But when that was debated in the Dáil, that was all that was in that bill, right? And then in the last week, with multiple other bills being rammed through at guillotines, where the normal legislative process at different stages, proper scrutiny, time for amendments, was short-circuited, essentially a new bill, 3 new bills in fact, were put into a bill that was about something else. And one of the things that was in it was to do with offshore industrial wind, right? So in other words, there was no scrutiny of it. Journalists didn't know what was happening really. The TVs didn't have any amendments. This is cynical ploy, right? The most, contemptuous of democracy, and we did our best to ring the alarm bells about this, but it related to changing the planning process for industrial wind, effectively, for offshore renewables, so that now, as well as all this stuff that we have here, this absolute scandal, where we have the lowest level of marine protected areas by a mile anywhere in Europe, and the developers have been allowed to select their own sites. And that is the key issue in all of this. That's the absolute key issue. See, people can go on about Denmark, international comparisons, all they like, right? The point is, developers should not be allowed to select the sites where they feel like developing. That's the in the legislation, this is just another indication of what's happening with the state on this, and how it's a fiddle that's going on here, right? And where the developers are clearly dictating what's happening. Is that this will mean that developers of these offshore wind industrial things will now have a flexible application process, right? They will be able to apply for permission to develop an industrial wind farm on a site like the Kish, but then change the application later. So the application, they may build something different from what they applied for. Now, I mean, that's a pretty serious thing. That fundamentally, I would argue, undermines the entire purpose of the planning process and the ability of people to be consulted, make submissions and all the rest of it. But the cynicism of bringing that in, last week, guillotining it, specifically for offshore industrial wind, tells you what is going on here. And I think that the message we have to send back to the government is absolutely not acceptable that developers choose sites, right? And that it has to be people who are expert and independent in assessing the sensitivity, the biological, marine sensitivity and so on, who say where it is acceptable and not acceptable to build industrial wind farm technology. And we have one of the biggest marine areas in Europe. There's plenty of areas to do this, right? But it needs to be properly planned in the same way as a development plan operates, right? Which is to say, yeah, you can build housing in that area, you have to have public amenity in that area, you have to have forest in that area, or whatever, right? That's, and then there's a certain amount of area that is considered suitable by independent people with proper consultation and all that, deciding, yes, it's okay to put a wind farm there. But it's not okay to put it there because it will be damaging. And just to underline, because I made this used exactly the same words the speaker did, time and time again during this debate, that to justify all this in terms of climate change, if the consequence of it is to damage the biggest carbon sink in the world, because that's what the sea is. If you create a dead sea in the name of climate action, you would have done far more damage to the effort to address climate change than the positive contribution of the wind farm. It's insane, right? But it's been driven not by a desire, in my opinion, primarily to address the climate crisis, but it's been driven by developers.
Yes.
Including the French state. I mean, it's around the French state. I just think that's very, very strongly to the government and be uncompromising.
Thank you, Richard. There's a gentleman right at the back.
Listen, just to let everybody know, you know these first tranche of projects, right? Cogley Wind Park and Arlington Williams put in their applications. They put in their applications on the 20th of, I think, 28th. We actually have only to the 28th this month to project, to marine area consent. I will make sure there's put up on the website for everything to reject it. Because once they get marine area consent, it goes to our board of development. Come on here. Going to be nearly impossible. Okay, and they're the two projects. They are Arden Dewey, which is the fish bank, and the other one is Cod, which is just said.
Okay, Jennifer, could you, yes?
Just on the marine area consent is not permission to do anything once you develop present. You still have to apply to a board of law.
That's the first stage.
You're right.
It's the first stage. And then they go from working on it, it's very hard to objection.
No, it's very easy to object to the board of law, and it has to be a full environmental assessment.
You might be asking where you from?
I'm local to.
Local to?
Yeah, for Glen, I live in Glen, very strong. Just because my colleagues have the opportunity to speak with you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, here. Want to come up here?
Yeah.
Look, I think this is a really difficult thing because you don't want, there's nobody in this room that doesn't think renewable energy is a good idea, I imagine. And I don't think there's anybody in the room that doesn't think that we need renewable energy at this point. So the question is, do we need renewable energy? Yes, no. If we need renewable energy, where are we getting it from? How are we going to make the decisions around it? We have proposals around fixed energy, and you're quite right, floating is better, and floating is coming, but it's not here yet. And it's not here, it's not here. And not at the scale that we think that we can get. I'm not by saying that suggesting that we build our university. Please just let me finish. There is such an opportunity for Ireland to develop floating wind energy at that scale, and to get to the point where we're not only self-sufficient in our own energy, but we're actually exporting it.
Could you let Jennifer have a Jennifer, would you like to come to the front because we can't hear you properly?
We have the opportunity, we have the fifth largest territory in the EU when you include our sea area. It's 7 times our land mass, and we have an extraordinary opportunity to do this right. You're quite right about Scotland and what they're beginning and floating. We are way behind, and we can get there. But we need A, the interconnector, and B, we need the airborne capacity increased. That's going to take us more time because, as Oisin says, Minister Smith says, and as Forbes Devon says, we are way behind on this, and we have to develop the grid capacity to be able to take that on. If we can get that on the West Coast, and it's primarily on the West Coast because of the scale of the area there, we have the opportunity to get to energy self-sufficiency, which is good not just from a climate perspective, but from an energy security perspective. And we do have the opportunity to export energy as well, which is a good thing to have in reserve. We can see that energy prices fluctuate depending on how strong wind is. In June this year, about 30% of our energy came from renewable sources. The difference in the cost of electricity when there was a lot of wind and when there was no wind ranged from €90 a megawatt to €202 a megawatt. So it really does have an effect, not just on security, but on cost. So in general, renewable is a good thing. Now we have a specific question here, and we have A, is it the right place to do it? Is it the place for it at all? And B, how are we making decisions in relation to that, and how transparent is that? And to be honest with you,